The B&O Railroad Museum is housed in a structure that began as a station in 1851 and expanded to a passenger car service facility with a large roundhouse in 1884. The roundhouse roof collapsed in a 2003 snowstorm, causing a lot of damage to artifacts, some of which were beyond repair. Most of the photos and clips in this video were taken in 2024, but my earliest visit to the museum was in 1987. I saw this South Shore Electric, since moved to Illinois, and the Freedom Train locomotive, which I believe is now being restored. I also saw this C&O 284 Kanawha and a snowplow, which are apparently still at the museum, but I didn't notice them on my recent trip. Here are the Tom Thumb and C&O 490, which we'll see again later in the video. On a 1992 trip, the Freedom Train and Engine 802 were still there, and I saw this 484 Northern, which has since been restored and moved to Virginia. The B&O Museum complements the Pennsylvania Railroad Museum that you saw in one of my earlier videos because it houses a collection of mostly 19th century equipment. The Pennsylvania Museum has mostly 20th century artifacts. The equipment in the Pennsylvania Museum was originally gathered for display in the 1939 New York's World's Fair. The B&O gathered much of this equipment for the 1893 Columbian Exposition. Working replicas of their oldest locomotives were built for the 1927 Fair of the Iron Horse. The Roundhouse exhibits take you through a progression in time, starting with a horse-drawn rail car. This is a replica of the 1830 Tom Thumb, the first American-built locomotive to run on a common carrier railway. There are replicas of the 1831 York and the 1832 B&O No. 2 Atlantic, and the actual 1836 John Hancock, which was displayed at the Columbian Exposition. These locomotives were called grasshoppers because of the movement of the beam arrangement that placed the crankshaft between the piston and the beam's pivot. This allowed a long low-pressure cylinder to gain leverage as it drives the crank. Also a replica, this is an example of a 420 locomotive that featured a more efficient horizontal boiler. The type was called a one-armed billy because of the single connecting rod connecting the pistons to the single wheel on each side. The 1851 Pioneer has room for fuel over a trailing truck. This 0808 wheeler from 1853 was damaged in the roof collapse, but has since been restored. This classic 440 Atlantic, the William Mason, pulled Lincoln's inaugural train. It was on display at the 1893 Columbian Exposition, the 1904 St. Louis Fair, and the 1927 Fair of the Iron Horse. It was also used in several movies, including The Great Locomotive Chase. Here's an 1868 wooden passenger coach. This 10-wheeler has a camel design with the cab over the boiler. The added weight over the drivers improves traction. 260 moguls like this one, from 1875, had more tractive power than the earlier Atlantics. This one was on display in the 1927 Fair of the Iron Horse. I've heard that 280 consolidations like this one from 1888 were the most common steam configuration in America. Here are a wooden Pullman coach from 1890 and a wooden combined passenger and baggage coach from 1900. This CNJ 442 Atlantic Camelback from 1901 has huge wheels allowing very high speeds. In 1926, it rushed Enrico Caruso to New York from Philly for an opera engagement, reportedly reaching speeds of 100 miles an hour. It has a large firebox to burn anthracite. However, the design results in the engineer being dangerously separated from the fireman and was eventually outlawed by the ICC. An interesting tunnel clearance car. This is a 3-cylinder shay. You can see a shay in operation in my video from the Cass Railroad. This little electric switcher from 1909 worked at Fells Point for 45 years. Stepping out of the Roundhouse into the yard, we saw this train arriving. We didn't ride it. It only goes about a mile, and the facility isn't equipped to handle a steam locomotive. The operational locomotives are a GP30 from 1962 and a GP15T from 1982. We walked around the yard and looked at various pieces of equipment. This EMDSW-1 was damaged in the roof collapse, but has been restored. Next we entered the former passenger car shop, where some of the newer locomotives are kept. This 10-wheeler from 1902 is probably not in good enough shape to go into the Roundhouse. This 282 Mikado was built in 1918. Two diesels side by side allow us to see the difference between the slant-nose EMC EA from 1937 on the left and the F7 bullnose from 1951 on the right. I was allowed into the cab of this 1938 fireless locomotive. By far the largest engine in the museum is this articulated 2666 Allegheny. As I walked past it, I noticed the cylinders are the same size, both high pressure, unlike Mallet articulated locomotives in some of my other videos. Here's a great example of attempts made to streamline steam engines. Originally a 484 Hudson built in 1926, this one was reworked in 1946 to add the streamlined shell. Looking up on the inside over the wheels, you can see the boiler on the left and the shell of the engine on the right. The wheels are huge. An 040T switcher. This little diesel worked at Domino Sugar and is nicknamed Sweet Toot. I'm not sure why this 1863 10-wheeler isn't in the Roundhouse. As a thank you gesture at the end of World War II, the French put together a train with a car for every U.S. state. This is the one for Maryland. The museum also has 3 model railroads. This one is an outdoor G-scale. This is the older of their 2HO layouts in 1987, and here it is moved to a new location in 2024.
Where are they? Oh, it's not there. Oh, that would stop. That would stop. Let me. Mama, it's here again. Oh, the big long ones. What?
This is their newest HO layout.